You remember that morning better than you'd like to admit. Not because anything dramatic happened, because nothing did. You checked your account the way you always did, half out of habit, half bracing for bad news. And there it was, $50. Not enough to feel like money, just enough to remind you of everything you hadn't figured out yet. You didn't know it yet, but that $50 was about to become the longest, strangest relationship of your life. This isn't a video about investing. It's not a lecture on stocks, spreadsheets, or financial freedom, words you've heard so many times they've stopped meaning anything. This is the story of a version of you, sitting exactly where you're sitting right now, tired of starting over, tired of watching other people's lives look easier than yours, making one decision so small nobody else even noticed it happen. Years later, you'd look back on that morning and realize something that still gives you chills. It was never the $50 that changed your life. It was what you refused to stop doing with it. Stay with me, because the person you become by the end of this story is not who you think you are right now. And the moment everything shifts, you will not see it coming. If you've ever sat with a number like that and felt that exact feeling, subscribe now. This story is about to get very real.
Let's rewind. You didn't start with a business plan. You didn't start with a mentor, a rich uncle, or a strategic advantage. You started with $50 sitting in your account. After rent, after the phone bill, after the $12 you spent on something you regret. $50. That's it. That's the whole beginning. And here's the part nobody says out loud. $50 doesn't feel like a beginning. It feels like an ending. It feels like proof that you're behind, that everyone else got a head start, that the game was rigged before you even opened your eyes this morning. You've scrolled past people flying business class. You've watched someone your age post a picture in front of a car that costs more than you've made in 3 years combined. And some quiet, ugly voice in your head whispers, "That's never gonna be you." But here's the question that changes everything, and I need you to actually sit with it instead of skimming past it. What if the $50 was never the point? What if the $50 was just the test? Because here's what almost nobody tells you about people who build real wealth. The money was never the hard part. The hard part was what you decided to become while you didn't have it. You didn't know it yet, sitting there with your $50, but you were about to make one decision that 90% of people never make. You were about to not quit. Not because you were braver, not because you were smarter, but because you were angrier at staying the same than you were afraid of failing. And that's where it actually begins. Here's what your first 30 days with that $50 actually looked like. And I promise you, it was not glamorous. You didn't triple it overnight. You didn't find some secret loophole. What you did was smaller and honestly, almost boring. You looked at the $50 and asked one question most people never bother asking. What is the smallest possible version of this I can start today? Not the perfect version, not the Instagram version, the smallest one. Maybe it was buying something for $12 and reselling it for $20. Maybe it was spending 4 hours learning a skill you could sell for cash by Friday. Maybe it was simply not spending the $50 at all, and instead protecting it like it was the last ember of a fire you were trying to keep alive through a storm. And here's the part that separates you from everyone who stayed stuck. You didn't wait to feel ready. You made the ugly first move. It wasn't good. It probably embarrassed you a little, but it was real. And real, even when it's small, beats perfect when perfect never happens. Day 7, you had $68. Not life-changing, but something inside you shifted because for the first time you had proof, not hope, proof. You had turned effort into money, even a little bit of it, and that proof became the fuel for everything after. Day 30, you had a little over $200. Still not enough to brag about, still not enough to quit your job or post a screenshot, but enough to notice a pattern that would define the next several years of your life. Small moves, repeated without emotion, compound into something the beginning version of you could never have imagined. Here's what you need to understand, and I need you to actually hear this instead of just nodding along. Compounding doesn't feel like anything for a long time. It feels like nothing is happening. It feels like you're working hard for basically no result. That feeling is not a sign you're doing it wrong. That feeling is the price of admission. Everyone who ever built something real paid that exact price in that exact currency. Boredom, invisibility, and doubt, long before the numbers ever looked impressive. You kept reinvesting instead of spending. You kept showing up on the days it felt pointless. You kept treating $50 and then $200 and then $800 like it mattered, even when the amount itself was still embarrassingly small compared to where you wanted to be. If you've ever felt like your effort isn't enough to count yet, drop a comment right now saying, "Still building." I want to see how many of you are in this exact phase. And that discipline, that refusal to treat small money like it was meaningless, was quietly rewriting who you were becoming. Because here's the secret hiding underneath all of this. You weren't just building money, you were building a person who doesn't quit. And that person was about to be tested in a way you weren't ready for.
Nobody talks about this part. Everyone loves the highlight reel, the started with $50 headline, but they skip straight to the part where it worked. They skip the month everything fell apart. Because it did fall apart. Maybe not all at once, but enough to make you question everything. Maybe a deal you counted on collapsed. Maybe you lost money you couldn't afford to lose. Maybe someone you trusted took advantage of how hungry you were and left you further behind than when you started. And in that moment, sitting with less than you had a few weeks ago, a thought crept in that felt less like a thought and more like a fact. Maybe you're just not built for this. Here's what almost nobody admits. That thought is not rare. Every single person who has ever built anything worth having sat exactly where you're sitting right now, at least once, usually more than once. The story just doesn't get told, because quitting isn't a good story. Quitting doesn't get a highlight reel. But you didn't quit, not because it didn't hurt. It hurt plenty. You kept going because somewhere along the way the goal had quietly changed on you without you even noticing. It stopped being about the $50 becoming $500. It became about proving something to the version of you who almost gave up. About not becoming another cautionary tale whispered at family dinners. Yeah, they tried something once, didn't work out. You went back to basics. You cut the noise. You stopped chasing the fast win and started respecting the slow one. You made peace with the fact that this might take longer than you wanted and that the timeline wasn't actually the enemy. Impatience was. And here's where it gets interesting, because the setback that almost broke you was quietly teaching you the one skill that separates people who build lasting wealth from people who get lucky once and lose it all. You learned how to lose money without losing yourself. That's the actual turning skill, not the making, the surviving. Because anyone can look brilliant when things are going right. The real test, the one that decides everything, is who you are when the numbers are red and nobody's watching, and quitting would be so much easier than continuing. You passed that test, quietly, with no audience, with no proof it would even matter yet. And that's exactly when things started to turn.
Here's the part where most people expect a miracle. A lottery ticket, a viral moment, a stranger handing you an opportunity out of nowhere. That's not what happened. What happened was quieter and honestly, almost anticlimactic, which is exactly why nobody talks about it. The compounding you couldn't see for months finally became visible. Not because anything magical occurred, but because you had simply been doing the unglamorous thing long enough that the curve started to bend. You looked back one day, maybe scrolling through old notes, old numbers, old messages to yourself, and you realized something that hit differently than you expected. The version of you with $50 couldn't have imagined this. Not because the amount is unbelievable, but because that version of you didn't yet believe you were someone things like this happened to. And that's the actual turning point. Not the money, the identity shift underneath it. You stopped being someone who was trying to make money and became someone who simply builds. Quietly, consistently, without needing anyone to confirm it was working. Opportunities that used to feel impossible started to feel like the next obvious step, not because luck changed, but because you had spent months, maybe years, becoming the kind of person those opportunities recognize. This is the part they don't put in the headline. Started with $50 isn't really the story. Never stopped is the entire story. The $50 was just small enough to be forgettable. What made it unforgettable was you. If you're somewhere in this journey right now, whether you're at the $50 phase or the turning point phase, comment your current number below. Not to compare, to witness it. Because 6 months from now, I want you to come back to this comment and see how far you've actually moved.
So let's talk about you. Not the version of you in this story, the version of you watching this right now. Maybe you don't have $50 of extra money either. Maybe the number in your account right now makes you flinch a little when you check it. Here's what this story is actually trying to tell you. The amount was never the qualifier. It was never the reason you hadn't started, and it was never going to be the reason you succeed either. What actually determines whether this becomes your story or just a video you watched and forgot by tomorrow is one decision, the same one made at minute 2 of this video. Will you make the smallest possible move today, or will you wait for a bigger number that conveniently never arrives? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people don't fail because they started with too little. They fail because they were waiting for permission that money was never going to give them. $50 was never going to feel like enough. $500 wouldn't have either. $5,000 wouldn't have either. The feeling of enough doesn't come from the number. It comes from the decision to move despite the number. You don't need the whole staircase. You need to see the next step. That's it. That's the entire mechanism behind every single started with nothing story you've ever admired from a distance. The people you envy didn't get the different starting line. They just refused to stay standing at it. And the wildest part? The version of you 5 years from now, the one with the number and the bank account you're currently embarrassed to admit out loud, that version is being built or destroyed by what you do in the next 24 hours after watching this. Not next year, not when things settle down. The next 24 hours. So here's where we land. You started with $50, not because $50 was magic, but because it was small enough that you no longer used "I don't have enough" as your excuse. And you never stopped, not because it was easy, not because you never doubted it, not because you never sat in the dark wondering if you were wasting your time. You never stopped because somewhere along the way, stopping became more painful than continuing. That's the whole story. That's the only story that has ever mattered in wealth building. Not the amount, the refusal to quit on the amount. So here's my question for you, and I actually want you to answer it, not just think about it and scroll away. What's your $50? Whatever it is, the numbers sitting in your account, the idea you've been too scared to start, the small move you've been putting off because it feels too small to matter. That's your beginning. Not someday, not when it feels bigger. Now, while it still feels small enough to be brave about. If this story moved something in you, subscribe right now, because this channel exists for exactly one reason: to walk you through what nobody tells you about building real wealth from real starting points, not fantasy ones. Comment below with your version of $50. I read every single one, and I want to know where your beginning actually is. And if you want to see what happens after the $50, the mistakes, the mindset traps, and the exact moments that quietly separate people who build wealth from people who just talk about it, the next video is waiting for you. And trust me, you don't want to miss where this goes next. You already have what you need to start. You always did.